Welcome to our next discipleship class. So we are here with what will be part 2 of our last teaching in this series on what's coming next. We don't get our end times scenario from a crystal ball, but we get it from the Word of God. So as we have talked about these last times, the world uses a crystal ball, among other deceptive methods, seeking to know the future, but only God's Word has laid out what is to come. So that's what we're using. Only the Bible can tell us what's coming next. So, from Isaiah 47, he says, so take your stand with your spells and your many sorceries, which the world does as they try to find ways from within their worldly structure what's coming next. Isaiah goes on, which you have wearied yourself with from your youth. In other words, Israel had practiced these idolatrous practices for many years. You are worn out with your many consultations, so let them stand and save you. The astrologers who observe the stars, who predict monthly what will happen to you. Look, they are like stubble, fire burns them up. They cannot deliver themselves from the power of the flame. So certainly any kind of God that can't deliver themselves are not going to be able to deliver anybody else. Only God declares the end from the beginning. Remember what happened long ago, for I am God, and there is no other. I am God, and no one is like me. I declare the end from the beginning, and from long ago, what is not yet done, saying, my plan will take place, and I will do my will. Jesus says similar to this. He says in the Gospel of John, talking to his disciples at the Last Supper, he said, look, I'm telling you these things ahead of time, so when they happen, you'll believe. I'm letting you know ahead of time. Only God can do that. Only God knows the future and can announce it, right? So again, in Isaiah, I declared to you long ago, I announced it to you before it occurred, so you could not claim my idol caused them. My carved image and cast idol control them. God is letting them know so they don't attribute it to some false means. You have heard it, observe it all. Will you not acknowledge it? From now on, I will announce new things to you, hidden things that you have not known. So, in our last presentation here, we are going to deal with predictions about the tribulation, which also involves the rapture of the church. So, we probably won't get into the rapture until part 2, but we will certainly get into the tribulation. And I think that we need to really understand as we go through this that the tribulation is a piece of time that is much of the prophet's focus in the Old Testament, and it is pushed off to the end, which we understand chapters 6 through 18 in the book of Revelation. So again, this is the foundation for what we're using here is Dr. Norman Geisler's presentation with some alterations that I have done to it, but for the most part it's his. And so we're going to look at, number one, the nature of the tribulation. So it is Daniel's 70th week, right? 70 weeks, or sevens, are decreed about your people, the Jews, your holy city, Jerusalem, to finish the transgression, put an end of sin, to atone for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal both vision and prophet, and to anoint a most holy place. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth out of the word to restore and build Jerusalem to the coming of an anointed one, a prince, there shall be 7 weeks. And after the 62 weeks, so the 7 and 62 is 69, an anointed one will be cut off and shall have nothing, will not receive his kingdom. And the people of the prince who is to come, the Antichrist, shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, And he shall make a strong covenant with many for 1 week, that last 7 years, that 70th 7-year period, because you have the 2 7-year periods, the 69 7-year periods after that, 69 7-year periods in total, and then this 1 7-year period pushed off to the future. And he says, he'll make a strong covenant with many for 1 week, that's 7 years, and for half of the week he shall put an end to sacrifice and offering. The second half, the offering and sacrifices made in the temple built during the first half of the tribulation will be stopped. Paul the Apostle tells us in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 that the son of perdition, the Antichrist, the beast, he'll go into the temple declaring himself to be God, and that is the abomination of desolation Jesus talked about in Matthew 24:15 in the context of the tribulation period. Number 2, it is a time of distress for Jacob or Israel. Now, when God calls Israel Jacob, he is referring to them in a sense almost after the flesh. It's a reminder of their roots because they have fallen into sin and carnality as a nation, and they're acting like Jacob as opposed to acting like Israel, the new name God gave him, which means governed by God or prince with God. So it says, alas, that day is great, there is none like it. This, again, referring to the worst time in human history, none like it. There can only be one of those times. It is a time of distress for Jacob or Israel, yet he shall be saved out of it. God will deliver them by the end of the tribulation period. So here is that chart again. You can stop the video if you like and take a better look at it, but this is Nebuchadnezzar's dream, the idol that he saw, the image from Daniel chapter 2, right? The head of gold, chest and arms of silver, stomach and thighs of brass, and the legs mixed with iron and clay. And then we see that that's the Babylonian Empire with the head. The silver was the Media-Persian Empire. Then it was the Grecian Empire, and finally Rome. And then Rome had an eastern and western division represented in the legs, and then finally the 10 toes would be the 10-division empire, the resurgence of Rome off into the future. So that it is during that time that 7-year period relates to. All right, so we see the tribulation period with the red arrow there. That is the time that we are dealing with during the revived Roman Empire. Number 3, it is an end time period just before Christ returns. So Jesus refers to this again in Matthew 24 and 25. He is speaking in the context of the Great Tribulation or the tribulation period. And starting at verse 4 here, we will jump through obviously some verses to hit up through 21. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginning of birth pangs. Now, though these are happening now, and this will continue to escalate up until the tribulation period, these indications match also specifically with the first 4 seals that are broken and what they typically refer to as the 4 horsemen. And so this is the beginning of birth pangs or sorrows. And so birth pangs, as you get closer and closer to delivery, they get, obviously from what I understand, never experienced it, but they get more intense and they get more frequent. So these birth pangs are really related to the tribulation period, and then what the tribulation period does is it gives birth to the Messianic reign. So that's really the metaphor that's used there for all of what is going on. So there'll be an increasing intensity as well as the sheer number of events as the tribulation period moves through unto the end. It says, then they will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death. Many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel, the prophet. So when you see it, you're going to see this guy accomplish this, right? For then there will be great tribulation, such has not been from the beginning of the world until now, nor and never will be. So obviously we're speaking of the same period. It is an end-time event. Jesus is talking about off into the future. We're still awaiting that day. It is a time dominated by the Antichrist or the beast. 1 John 2, children, it is the last hour, and as you have heard, the Antichrist is coming. So now many Antichrists have come. Who is a liar but he who denies that Jesus is the Christ? This is Antichrist. So the Antichrist will come. There are those that will foreshadow him, that will look like him. I mean, obviously, people that attempt to decimate the Jews over the years. I mean, the Emperor Domitian, even earlier than that, Nero with the Christians. You get to the Reformation period. I mean, the Reformers actually thought the Pope was the Antichrist because of his persecution of the Reformers. Now, they were obviously misunderstanding that. However, at that time, they were expecting Christ to return at any time because they thought they were in the tribulation because they thought the Pope was the Antichrist. So their eschatology was not good. However, their theology was a little better than their eschatology. Anyways, the Antichrist will ultimately come, but there will be those like Hitler, killing Jews and persecuting them specifically, who are a precursor. Antiochus Epiphanes, 165 BC. Again, same type. Now, he actually desecrated a pig on the altar at the temple. He hated the Jews. He was a brutal man, and he certainly, he's mentioned in the book of Daniel, but he is not the Antichrist. I mean, he was long gone by the time Jesus showed up and was talking about the abomination of desolation, and John here mentioning that the Antichrist's arrival is still yet future. Number 5, he makes a 7-year covenant with the Jews, and he shall make a strong covenant with many for 1 week. That's 7 years, right? So we talked about that. He'll go halfway through, and then it is during the first half of the tribulation period. The rebuilt temple is completed. The Jews are worshiping in it. You have the 2 witnesses in Revelation 11. They are witnessing and untouchable basically during that time. And then finally, the abomination of desolation happens at the midway point in the tribulation period. Number 6, he breaks the covenant halfway through this last 7-year period. And he shall make a strong covenant with many for 1 week, and for half of the week, 3.5 years, he shall put an end to sacrifice and offering. That's because he wants to be worshipped himself. And then on the wing of abominations shall come one who makes desolate until the decreed end is poured out on the desolator. So, again, this is the abomination of desolation, where he declares himself to be God. Number 7, he claims to be God and demands that all worship him. So here from 2 Thessalonians 2, let no one deceive you in any way, Paul says, for that day will not come unless the rebellion. I'll talk about this later on. I think that's a very, very unfortunate translation The word is apostasia. It means departure. And really, it's like unless the departure comes first and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the son of destruction, who opposes and exalts himself against every so-called God or object of worship, so that he takes his seat in the temple of God, proclaiming himself to be God. And then in Revelation 13, in relating to the same thing, because in Revelation 13, the first half talks about the rise of the beast or the Antichrist. The second half deals with the false prophet that has everybody worshiping the beast. So it says, and the beast was given a mouth uttering haughty and blasphemous words, and it was allowed to exercise authority for 42 months, 3.5 years. It opened its mouth to utter blasphemies against God, blaspheming his name and his dwelling, that is, those who dwell in heaven. So he will claim to be God himself. This is obviously a blasphemy along with everything else he utters. Number 8, he persecutes and kills those who believe in Christ. Revelation 13, also, it, talking about the beast, was allowed to make war on the saints and to conquer them. It was allowed to give breath to the image of the beast, so that the image of the beast might even speak and might cause those who would not worship the image of the beast to be slain. Also, it caused all, both small, great, rich, poor, free, slave, to be marked on the right hand or the forehead, so that no one can buy or sell unless he has the mark, that is, the name of the beast or the number of its name, for it is the number of a man, and his number is 666. So this has obviously been widely recognized for years throughout the world, and but it's coming. Now this is going to be an economic system that you will have to vow loyalty to the Antichrist in order to be involved with. So he will require that, and that will be that will be a sign of the loyalty to him in order to be involved with it. Number 9 is it's a time of God's great judgment. So this is the beginning of the opening of the seals in the beginning of the tribulation period. Now I watched when the Lamb opened one of the 7 seals, and I looked, behold, a white horse, and its rider had a bow, and a crown was given to him, and he came out conquering and to conquer. So the conquering one on the white horse is believed to be the Antichrist, because he has a bow with no arrow, so he conquers politically. He does not come on the scene militarily, though he does have power, and he comes conquering and to conquer, only the conquering is through non-military force at this point. The second seal is the second horse. When he opened the second seal, there came another horse, bright red. Its rider was permitted to take peace from the earth, so that men should slay one another. So we have war. You see the same progression from Matthew 24. When he opened the third seal, I looked, and behold, a black horse, and its rider had a pair of scales in his hand. And I heard one saying, a quart of wheat for a denarii, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarii, and do not harm the oil and the wine. And so again, now we have famine coming in, which is always the result of war. You have a lot of stuff destroyed because of the war, and food manufacturing and farming and all that is put on the back burner for survival. When he opened the 4th seal, I looked, and behold, a pale horse, and its rider came, was death, and Hades followed him, and they were given authority over the 4th of the earth to kill with the sword, famine, pestilence, wild beasts of the earth. When he opened the 5th seal, I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slain for the word of God and for the witness they had borne. And when he opened the 6th seal, I looked, and behold, there was a great earthquake, and the sun became black as sackcloth, the moon became like blood. So this is a time of great judgments. Now, when we get into the discussion on the rapture and the various views, I want you to remember that this is a time, once these seals begin to open up, this is the wrath of God being poured out upon the world from heaven. So this does not come at the end of the tribulation period. It starts at the very beginning, which is why it's called the time of Jacob's trouble. Number 10, it is climaxed with the last great battle at Armageddon. In Revelation 16, for they are demonic spirits performing signs, who go abroad to the kings of the whole world to assemble them for battle on the great day of God Almighty. And they assembled them at the place that is in Hebrew is called Armageddon. And then Revelation 14, so the angel swung his sickle to the earth and gathered the clusters from the vine of the earth and threw them into the great winepress of the wrath of God. And the winepress was trodden outside the city, and blood came out from the winepress up to the horses' bridles for a distance of 200 miles. So this is going to be a massive war, massive bloodshed. We saw in the earlier presentation the Valley of Megiddo, just a breathtaking view. It's enormous there. I've been there. Huge, huge place, just an enormous plain. And so that is where the battle will be climaxed. Now, it's not as if we get to the place where everything is kind of going along and then all of a sudden there's just this one battle. This is the Antichrist is on a campaign throughout this tribulation period. He's gathering nations. You know, we get from Daniel that, and also from the book of Revelation when you combine them, that yes, he has this 10-nation confederacy, but few of the nations want to break away. He forces them to stay. So there's definitely some political intrigue going on there. Not that we're going to know exactly how that will work out, but it's going to happen. And the Antichrist grows in his military efforts, and then eventually is on this campaign really to take over more of the world when Jesus interrupts that, and that actually creates the Battle of Armageddon. So again, that's the kind of the combination between the book of Daniel and the book of Revelation. Number 11, during the tribulation, a remnant of Jews and Gentiles are saved and preserved by God through the trials. Now, chapter 6 in Revelation ends with the question, after it talks about, the wrath of God coming. It says, like, who can stand here? Like, who can withstand the wrath of God? Well, and then you have chapter 7, and it answers the question. I heard the number of the sealed, which is 144,000 sealed from every tribe of the sons of Israel, Jews. After this I looked, and behold, a great multitude that no one could number, from every nation, tribe, people, languages, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed in white robes with palm branches in their hands. That would be Gentiles. So you have the 144,000 Jews, 12,000 from every tribe, and then you have them distinct from the Gentiles. Now, that's one of the reasons that I am convinced that the church will not be in the tribulation period, because you have a distinction made between Jews and Gentiles. In the church, there is no distinction. It doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter whether you're man, woman, if you're slave or free, if you're rich or poor. None of those distinctions have any effect in relation to your categorization among God's people. Now, so that's not to say that there's no genders and none of that. That's silly. That's misrepresenting what it's saying. Paul is trying to say everybody is equal in their standing within the church. The church is not a Jewish organization. It's not a Gentile organization. It's neither. It's a combination. He tells us that the mystery of the church is that Jews and Gentiles would be in one body before God. They're all in Christ. So in the nation of Israel, when Jesus returns and establishes the kingdom for the 1,000-year reign, the Jews do have a priority because it's fulfilling what the Jews were promised in the Old Testament regarding land and descendants and the fulfillment of a king and a throne of David and everything. So the Jews will have a priority in some sense, and then obviously there'll be Gentiles also involved, but there is a distinction. But the church does not have that distinction. So you can't have God's people with distinction, without distinction, and then them be the same thing. I mean, you'd be violating the law of non-contradiction, among other things. So it's just bad eschatology and bad theology. So number 12, it is followed by Christ's return to earth in judgments in his millennial reign. So from Revelation 19 and 20, then I saw heaven opened, and behold, a white horse. Now, though this is a white horse, the rider is much different. The one sitting on it is called Faithful and True, and in righteousness he judges and makes war. And the armies of heaven, arrayed in fine linen, white and pure, were following him on the white horses. From his mouth comes a sharp sword with which to strike down the nations, and he will rule them with a rod of iron. This will be an enforced righteousness during this time, because you will still have people with their sin natures, and though they're saved people entering into the millennial reign, they're going to be giving birth to people who need to make a decision for Christ. They all have sin natures. They have not been, put into their resurrected bodies yet. Their bodies are still subject to death, and so their sin natures are going to affect them in a way that he will have to rule the nations with a rod of iron. He has a name written, King of Kings and Lord of Lords, and they, the saints, came to life and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years, talking about the Old Testament saints. Daniel chapter 12, raising them up so that they can be part of this promised reign on earth, the Messianic kingdom promised to Israel. So he's going to raise up the Israelites to be part of that. I mean, it only makes clear sense. So the return to establish the kingdom there on earth through the nation of Israel. Be a wonderful time when it happens. No more of this stuff in the world the way it is. All right, so the next is the time of the tribulation. In the first century, some people think that the tribulation has already occurred, and they would be called preterists. In the future, as we would believe it, it's off into the future. We are futurists. So let's take a quick look at that. A crucial point, the date of the book of Revelation. Number 1, Revelation 6 to 18 describes the tribulation period, as we've talked about. If it was written after, now 70 AD, Jerusalem was destroyed. Question is, if the book of Revelation was written after 70 AD, then the tribulation is future and the preterists are wrong. So a preterist is one that thinks that basically all the judgments in the book of Revelation focus around what happened in Jerusalem in 70 AD. Number 3, there is strong evidence talking about the book of Revelation, was written well after 70 AD and actually in the 90s. Okay? Evidence that Revelation was written around 95 AD. Number 1, the early church father Irenaeus, 2nd century, spoke of John, who beheld the apocalyptic vision that he received almost in our day toward the end of Domitian's. So that would have been 96, Domitian's reign. So this is against heresies. Irenaeus is writing. Number 2, Victorinus in the 3rd century wrote, when John said these things, he was in the island of Patmos, condemned to the mines by Caesar Domitian. So again, would put him in the 90s. Eusebius in the 4th century confirmed the Domitian date of the 90s And then other early church fathers after 70 AD refer to the tribulation or Antichrist spoken of in Revelation as yet future. So again, these are people at the events and during that era, and so they're still looking after 70 AD. They're looking forward to this coming. So this is evidence, obviously not inside the Bible, but outside the Bible, for the date of the writing of the book of Revelation. John's exile on the island of Patmos, number 5, implies a later date when persecution was more rampant. It's in chapter 1, verse 9 of Revelation. Number 6, references to persecution and martyrdom in the churches reflect a later date. So in the letters to the churches, the church of Smyrna was under heavy persecution, and so they actually had nothing to look forward to other than death. So again, these letters in the book of Revelation talk about persecution and trial, and so it lends itself to a later writing. Number 7, Polycarp's reference to the church at Smyrna, which is basically Philippians, reveals that it did not exist in Paul's day as it did in Revelation 2:8. So when Paul wrote to the Philippians, which was the same area, then it's called the church at Smyrna when Jesus had John sent his letter to it. Number 8, the conditions of the 7 churches in Revelation 2 and 3 fit this later period rather than those reflected in Paul's later epistles written in the early 60s. So again, Paul was probably beheaded around 65, 66 AD, before the 70 AD wipeout of Jerusalem. So this is why the reference there, Paul was not really referring to any of these types of persecutions the same way they're listed in Revelation 2 and 3. Emperor worship reflected in Revelation did not exist in Nero's day, so he could not have been a fulfillment of it. So again, the worship of the Antichrist, the concept there was not really what was happening in Nero's day in the 60s. That is really pushed off specifically to the tribulation period, would have to be off in the future. Laodicea was a prosperous city in Revelation 3:17, yet it was destroyed by an earthquake in AD 61 and is unlikely to have been rebuilt so fast in such a flourishing city by 65. So Laodicea is the 7th letter, the 7th church written to in Revelation chapter 3, and they were very wealthy in the world, very materially prosperous, and where they were destroyed in 61 AD, so you're saying they would have rebuilt the city, have great prosperity by 70, which was really probably not within the realm of realization for them at that time. The significance of the AD 95 date. Number 1, preterists say Revelation's predictions about the 7-year tribulation were fulfilled in 64 to 70, the destruction of Jerusalem, and do not refer to a time period yet future. But if it was written after 70 AD, as the evidence shows, then preterists are wrong and futurists are right, namely it refers to a 7-year period yet to come. This is unfortunately a huge distinction here, and it confuses a lot of people in the church because preterists write a lot of books, interestingly enough. So taking that into consideration, we will start in on the topic of the rapture, but we won't go very far. We'll kind of introduce you to the various views, and then we'll get into the detail of them next time, but we'll start out with them. So the 5 views on the rapture and the tribulation. The first is pre-tribulationism. So again, where we just went through preterism, which is really the timing of the tribulation period, now we're talking about when will the church be raptured in relation to a future tribulation period. This assumes that the tribulation period is yet to come, which we believe it is, and which makes the most out of the consistency when you walk through all the prophecies regarding it in the Bible. So pre-tribulationism is that the rapture happens before the 7-year period, before the tribulation. Pre meaning before, and then tribulation, very simple. Mid-tribulation, I'll test you on it at the end, right? Obviously that is in the middle, so somehow the mid-tribulationists believe that at the middle point, the 3.5 years, when the Antichrist has the abomination of desolation, that somehow sparks off the rapture. There is a relatively new view that came and was popularized around 1990 by Marv Rosenthal called the pre-wrath view, and they see that as the rapture happening just before the end of the 7 years, kind of a 3/4 of the way through, if you will, or 80% of the way. And the idea is that all that's happening prior to that, that very end point is not the wrath of God. So the wrath of God gets poured out then, so it is a pre-wrath rapture. So the church can basically go through the tribulation period, get near the end, and then now God's going to pour out his wrath, so then the church is taken up just before the end. Very odd in its view, but we'll get into that. Post-tribulationism, obviously post meaning after, is at the end of the tribulation. So they see the tribulation ending, the second coming in Revelation 19, which does not have a rapture in it, but they believe, the post-tribulationists do, that the church goes up and meets Christ in the air and then basically turns around and comes back. Interesting view, but again, I think one of the many shortcomings of that is that you are creating the separation of the believers and unbelievers, which would mean that when Jesus does it at the entering into the kingdom, he's doing something that has already happened. So quite interesting. And it also means that there will be no saved people that are not in their resurrected bodies at the end of the tribulation period, because if they all get their bodies changed, which is the rapture, right? In the moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trump, right? Your body is changed so that it can enter heaven and be a glorified body. Well, if all the believers go up, there's no believers to enter into the kingdom to repopulate it. So a lot of problems with the post-tribulation rapture. And then preterism, as we talked about, no future rapture or tribulation, because the tribulation occurred between 64 and 70 AD. So preterism is tremendously problematic. A number of issues with that, but we'll move on here. So this is kind of a chart showing the 7-year tribulation period, and you'll notice that with pre-tribulationism on the top, you have the rapture occurring sometime prior to. Now, pre-tribulationists just know that the rapture can happen at any time. I mean, it could happen, and then it could be 10 years before the tribulation starts. Who knows? The point is that it is prior to. The mid-trib, which is the second one down, obviously at the middle, the pre-wrath, the next one, and then, or actually the wrath of God is seen. The next one down is actually post-tribulationism, and then the pre-wrath is right after that. You notice that there's a question mark there, and then it says wrath of God after it. So Pre-tribulationists see the whole 7-year period as the wrath of God. The mid-tribulationists see only the second part, what Jesus calls the Great Tribulation. Now, it's called Great Tribulation because of the abomination of desolation and the fact that Satan is cast out of heaven by Michael the archangel in Revelation 12. And it says he comes down, he's angry, he's going to go after Israel for 42 months. So you have the wrath of God coming out of heaven, and you have the ferociousness of Satan during that time, which is why it becomes the worst time in world history. So, but anyways, the mid-tribbers see the wrath of God only coming after the midpoint of the tribulation, and then the post-tribbers and the pre-wrath rapturists see it as just coming near the end. And so then you have, obviously, as you can see in the chart there, then you have the Battle of Armageddon occurring, where Jesus returns during that time. This is another picture. We've seen this before. This is, I think, a good layout of kind of the whole scenario from the cross onward. And you see there, at the beginning, that is the pre-tribulation rapture that happens at the beginning. And then that is the mid-tribulation at the middle, so that you can have a reference here in this chart. And then you have the, that should be probably the pre-wrath, just before the end. And then finally you have the post-tribbers that happen as Jesus is returning. It occurs there. So I think that we will leave it there. I'll leave you with this chart, and we'll end for this week, and then that'll give us some time to get into it next week and be able to finish it up. Otherwise, we're going to start going through the rapture. We'll be part way through, and then so this way we can do the quick review at the beginning next week of the 5 views, or 4 views technically. The preterists don't really have a view, I guess, in reference to that, and then we'll move on right from there. So until then, may God richly bless you as you continue to study His Word.